Maria stood in her kitchen, her hands resting lightly on the counter as she stared at the steaming cup of tea before her. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, but its warmth couldn't chase away the chill creeping through her. Her mind replayed the small, seemingly inconsequential moments that had begun to gnaw at her. Jonathan had been distant lately, his once warm, inviting smiles now replaced by forced expressions and distracted nods. His phone, once casually left on the kitchen table, was now always in his pocket. And the cologne. He never used cologne except for special occasions, but now its scent lingered in the air daily. Maria had never been the jealous type. She prided herself on being understanding and fair. But something about Jonathan's recent behavior didn't sit right with her. It was in the way he hesitated before answering her questions or how he'd slip out of the room to take his calls. Her best friend Lucy had dismissed her concerns when she'd mentioned them. "He's probably just stressed with work," Lucy had said. "You're overthinking it, Maria. Don't go looking for problems that aren't there." But Maria couldn't ignore the ache in her chest. Her gut told her that something was wrong. That night, as she sat across from Jonathan at the dinner table, she decided to test her suspicion. "Are you working late again tomorrow?" she asked casually, stabbing at her salad. Jonathan barely glanced up from his plate. "Yeah. There's a project I need to finish. It's been crazy at the office." Maria nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on his face. "You've been working so hard lately. We barely see each other anymore." Jonathan's fork paused mid-air for a fraction of a second before he resumed eating. "It's just a busy season," he said. "It'll calm down soon. Do you want me to stop by with dinner one night?" "You must be exhausted," Maria offered, her tone light. Jonathan looked up then, his smile tight. "That's sweet of you, but it's fine. We usually just order in." Maria forced a smile and changed the subject, but inside, her doubts solidified. Jonathan wasn't just busy, he was hiding something. Later that night, as Jonathan snored softly beside her, Maria lay awake, staring at the ceiling. If she was going to find out the truth, she realized she'd need to take matters into her own hands. The idea had come to Maria in the early hours of the morning, a half-formed thought born of desperation. By the time the sun rose, it had taken root. If Jonathan was hiding something, she needed to see for herself. But how? He was cautious, his movements calculated. If she confronted him, he'd deny everything. She needed proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof. Maria spent the next day scouring thrift stores for the right outfit: worn jeans, an oversized jacket, and a tattered scarf. The look was complete with a smudge of dirt on her cheeks and a frayed beanie pulled low over her forehead. Standing before the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The polished, composed Maria was gone, replaced by a woman who could blend into the shadows unnoticed. It felt absurd at first. She almost laughed as she tied her scarf. But the stakes were too high for hesitation or self-doubt. If her suspicions were wrong, she could laugh about this later. If they weren't, Maria shoved the thought aside. That evening, as Jonathan left for his supposed late-night meeting, Maria followed. She gave him a head start, waiting until his car disappeared around the corner before slipping into her own. Her heart pounded as she tailed him through the city, her hands gripping the steering wheel. He wouldn't recognize her car. She'd borrowed it from a neighbor under the pretense of needing something smaller for errands. Jonathan's sleek black sedan finally came to a stop outside an upscale restaurant. Maria parked a safe distance away and slipped out of her car, her scarf pulled tighter around her face. She shuffled along the sidewalk, keeping her head down, her pulse racing. She'd practiced her gait in the mirror, slow, hesitant, like someone carrying the weight of an invisible burden. She watched as Jonathan stepped out of his car, smoothing his jacket. He checked his phone, a small smile tugging at his lips, before walking briskly toward the restaurant. Maria lingered by a lamppost, watching him disappear inside. The minutes stretched like hours. Maria's mind raced with possibilities. Was he meeting a client? A colleague? Or someone else entirely? Just as doubt began to creep in, the door to the restaurant swung open. Jonathan emerged, his hand resting on the small of a woman's back. Maria's stomach dropped. Even from a distance, she recognized the woman. The graceful stride, the cascade of dark hair. Catherine. Her sister. Maria froze, her breath catching in her throat. She felt like a statue rooted to the spot as Jonathan opened the car door for Catherine and helped her in. Their laughter, muffled by the night air, rang in Maria's ears. The car pulled away, its taillights glowing red as it disappeared down the street. Maria remained standing, her mind a blur of disbelief and fury. Betrayal burned in her chest, but it was not just Jonathan's. Her own sister. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away. Her disguise, the risk she had taken, all of it had been worth it. She had her answer. As she turned to leave, her shoulders straightened, and a new resolve took hold. If Jonathan and Catherine thought they could deceive her, they had gravely underestimated her. This was far from over. Maria drove home in silence, her hands clutching the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the pavement was the only sound, but inside her mind, a tempest raged. Jonathan, Catherine, together. The images played on a cruel loop, each frame a dagger to her heart. She pulled into her driveway and sat motionless for a long moment, the events of the evening sinking in. Her home, a place that once felt warm and safe, now seemed like a mockery of everything she had built with Jonathan. How long had it been a facade? How long had Catherine, her own sister, been part of this charade? Maria stepped into the house and closed the door behind her. The darkness felt suffocating, but she didn't bother turning on the lights. She dropped her bag on the counter and slumped into a chair, burying her face in her hands. The tears came then, hot and relentless, but they weren't just tears of sorrow, they were tears of anger, betrayal, and a simmering resolve. By the time the front door creaked open and Jonathan walked in, Maria had composed herself. She sat at the kitchen table, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. Jonathan paused, his surprise barely concealed, before offering her a tired smile. "Hey, you're up late," he said, shrugging off his coat and draping it over a chair. Maria forced a smile, her heart pounding in her chest. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, her voice steady. Jonathan nodded, oblivious to the storm beneath her calm demeanor. "It's been a long day. I'm going to grab a shower." He kissed her on the forehead, an act so casual it twisted the knife deeper, and disappeared down the hall. Maria sat there, the facade of her composure cracking as soon as he was out of sight. She clenched her fists, her mind racing. The betrayal wasn't just Jonathan's, it was Catherine's too. Her sister, the person she had confided in countless times, had been lying to her all along. The next morning, Maria's resolve hardened. She wasn't the kind of woman to sit idly by and let betrayal define her. She had seen enough dramas in her life to know that silence only emboldened the guilty. If Jonathan and Catherine thought they could trample over her, they were sorely mistaken. Maria began her day as though nothing had changed. She greeted Jonathan with a kiss, prepared breakfast, and even asked about his workday plans. He responded with the same rehearsed nonchalance that she now knew was a lie. But beneath her outward calm, Maria was making plans. She would not confront them, not yet. She needed more than suspicion and a fleeting glimpse. She needed evidence. Concrete, undeniable proof of their betrayal. If Jonathan and Catherine had decided to play a dangerous game, then Maria would make sure they paid the price for their audacity. Her first step was to secure the tools she needed. Over the following days, Maria researched surveillance equipment, buying discreet cameras and audio recorders online. She paid in cash and had them shipped to a friend's address, ensuring there would be no trail. At night, while Jonathan slept soundly beside her, Maria plotted. She would follow him again, track his movements, and document every secret meeting. She couldn't let her emotions dictate her actions, not yet. This wasn't just about catching them. It was about taking control. As she stared at the sleeping form of the man she once loved, Maria felt the weight of her decision. The pain was still there, raw and aching, but it was now accompanied by a simmering resolve. They thought they had fooled her, but Maria would show them that she was not a woman to be underestimated. This was only the beginning. Maria sat in the corner of her bedroom, the glow of her laptop illuminating her face as she scrolled through online forums and how-to guides. Surveillance cameras, audio bugs, GPS trackers. Her search history had become a catalog of espionage tools. Her heart thudded with a mix of apprehension and determination. This wasn't her world, but it would be. It had to be. Days earlier, she had installed the first of her devices, a small camera tucked inconspicuously into the frame of a decorative mirror in the living room. It had been nerve-wracking, sneaking around while Jonathan was at work, but she reminded herself that this was about reclaiming control. Her suspicions had already shattered her heart. Now she needed the truth. Jonathan's routine, once an afterthought in her mind, had become an obsession. Maria noted the times he left the house, the places he claimed to go, and the hours he returned. It wasn't long before the discrepancies started to emerge. A late meeting that ended too early. A canceled dinner with a client followed by a 2-hour gap he couldn't account for. Maria wasn't the only one under scrutiny. She kept her interactions with Catherine limited but observed her sister carefully during their weekly phone calls and occasional visits. Catherine was warm, her voice as friendly as ever, but Maria could now hear the tension in her words. Every laugh, every pause, was magnified in Maria's mind. How long had Catherine been lying to her? And why? The first breakthrough came 3 nights later. Jonathan had kissed her goodbye with his usual disarming smile, telling her he'd be working late. Maria, her heart hammering, watched his car disappear down the street before retreating to her laptop. She logged into the live feed from her hidden camera. It was nearly an hour later when Jonathan returned. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she watched him enter the living room with Catherine in tow. They stood close, too close. Jonathan leaned toward her, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and Maria's stomach churned as Catherine laughed softly, her hand lingering on his arm. Maria bit her lip to stifle a cry. She couldn't afford to lose control, not now. Her trembling fingers clicked the record button, capturing every damning moment. They spoke in hushed tones, their words indistinct. Maria adjusted the audio settings, straining to hear. "Can't keep doing this," Catherine's voice broke through, tinged with guilt. Jonathan sighed. "It's only until I figure things out with Maria. She wouldn't understand." "Jonathan," Catherine whispered, her voice wavering. "She's my sister. This is wrong." Maria felt the weight of her anger crush the remnants of her grief. Wrong? Catherine had the audacity to call it wrong now? After weeks, months, perhaps years of betrayal? Her hands clenched into fists and she forced herself to keep listening. Their conversation continued, a tangled web of excuses and half-hearted guilt. Jonathan promised he'd handle things soon, and Catherine agreed with a reluctant nod. Maria watched them embrace, their shadows stretching across the walls like specters. When they finally left the living room, Maria closed her laptop, her breath shallow. The recording was saved, the evidence undeniable. But instead of relief, Maria felt a deep, searing pain. They weren't just betraying her, they were rationalizing it, wrapping their betrayal in the guise of inevitability. Maria stood and paced the room, her emotions shifting from despair to resolve. She couldn't confront them yet, not when their lives were so delicately balanced. They thought they could manipulate her, but Maria would turn their own deceit against them. She wasn't just collecting evidence. She was building a weapon. And when the time came, she would wield it with precision. The first recording was only the beginning. Maria had known it would hurt to see Jonathan and Catherine together, but she hadn't anticipated the raw fury that accompanied it. It was as if each word they spoke was another blow to her chest. Yet, rather than paralyzing her, the pain sharpened her focus. Over the next week, Maria methodically expanded her surveillance. She installed a GPS tracker on Jonathan's car, slipping it into the wheel well late one night. The next morning, she feigned sleep as he kissed her goodbye and left for the day. When she checked the tracker's location, she saw his car parked at a familiar address, Catherine's apartment. The betrayal wasn't confined to their secret meetings. Maria reviewed the recordings from her cameras, listening intently as Jonathan spoke on the phone late at night. His tone was soft, coaxing, the same voice he used to woo her when they first started dating. It made her stomach churn. Catherine's voice on the other end was muffled but unmistakable, her words tinged with guilt and longing. But guilt wasn't enough. Maria needed more. She needed to hear them admit it, to see them expose themselves fully. She began piecing together their schedule, using the GPS tracker and her recordings to predict their movements. The more she watched and listened, the more adept she became at understanding their patterns. It was during one of these surveillance sessions that Maria uncovered something far worse than she had imagined. Jonathan and Catherine weren't just meeting for clandestine rendezvous. They were scheming. She replayed a conversation recorded from the living room camera late one evening. "This can't go on forever," Catherine said, her voice tense. "Maria deserves the truth." Jonathan sighed. "The truth? You think she'll forgive either of us?" "No. We need to be smart about this." "Smart?" Catherine's tone turned sharp. "You mean cruel? You're talking about stringing her along while we, what? Pretend this isn't happening?" Jonathan's reply was cold. "We'll handle it when the time is right. Until then, we stay careful. No one needs to know." Maria's blood ran cold. This wasn't just betrayal, it was premeditated. They had made a conscious decision to keep her in the dark, to manipulate her for their convenience. Her grief hardened into anger, her sadness crystallizing into resolve. If they thought they could outsmart her, they were mistaken. Maria began crafting her plan. Using an anonymous email account, she sent Catherine a cryptic message. "Does Jonathan tell you the same lies he tells me?" She made sure it came with no identifying information, but the delivery receipt confirmed it had been read within minutes. She waited for the cracks to form. Sure enough, the following day's recording caught Catherine confronting Jonathan. "Did you tell anyone about us?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Jonathan looked baffled. "Of course not. Why?" "I got a message." Catherine hesitated, her face pale. "Someone knows Jonathan." Jonathan's confidence faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "It's probably spam. Don't let it get to you. Just stay calm." Maria smirked as she watched the exchange unfold on her screen. The doubt was taking root and she planned to exploit it. Over the next few days, she sent Jonathan a similar message. "Do you think she doesn't know?" His reaction was predictable. He confronted Catherine the same night, accusing her of being careless. Their argument spiraled into a shouting match, each blaming the other for the increasing tension. Maria watched from her laptop, satisfaction blooming in her chest. The foundation of their deceit was beginning to crack. The pieces were falling into place. Maria documented every moment, every argument, every lie they told each other. The once cozy relationship between Jonathan and Catherine began to unravel under the weight of their guilt and paranoia. Maria wasn't just gathering evidence anymore. She was playing a game of psychological warfare and she was winning. Maria stared at her laptop screen, her lips pressed into a thin line. Jonathan and Catherine's once smooth facade was crumbling faster than she'd anticipated. The emails she had sent had sown enough paranoia to trigger arguments, but she knew she couldn't rely on their guilt alone. It was time to tighten the strings and take full control of their unraveling. That evening, Maria composed another anonymous message, this time to Catherine. "He's lying to you too. Do you think you're the only one? Check his phone the next time he's with you." She hit send, imagining the tension that would ripple through their next meeting. The following day, Maria tracked Jonathan's car through the GPS. Sure enough, it led to Catherine's apartment. She logged into the live feed from the small recorder she had discreetly placed under Catherine's couch on a prior visit. The clarity wasn't perfect, but the audio was enough to confirm her suspicions. "You're hiding something," Catherine's voice came through, sharp and accusatory. "What are you talking about?" Jonathan sounded genuinely baffled, but Maria could detect the underlying tension in his tone. Catherine didn't relent. "I saw a message on your phone last night. Something about her knowing." "Who else are you lying to, Jonathan?" There was a pause, and Maria could almost picture Jonathan's face, caught off guard and scrambling for an explanation. "Catherine, you're being ridiculous. You know I'm only with you." Maria's jaw tightened. His nonchalance, his arrogance, it fueled her resolve. Catherine's voice trembled as she pressed further, but Jonathan managed to placate her with promises and deflections. Maria knew it wouldn't last. Over the next few days, Maria intensified her strategy. She sent more emails, carefully worded to seem like they came from someone with intimate knowledge of their affair. She forged screenshots of fake text conversations, sending them anonymously to Catherine. The messages hinted that Jonathan was seeing other women too. Catherine's paranoia deepened. During one recorded conversation, her voice cracked as she confronted Jonathan again. "You're lying to me. I know you are. Who else are you seeing?" "For God's sake, Catherine." Jonathan exploded, his frustration boiling over. "Do you hear yourself? You're acting crazy." Maria smiled coldly at her screen. The balance of power between them was shifting just as she had planned. Their trust, once solid enough to betray her, was now disintegrating under the weight of her manipulation. Maria wasn't content with merely planting seeds of doubt. She staged subtle traps, orchestrating small moments to destabilize them further. She left a lipstick-stained coffee cup in Jonathan's car, one Catherine would immediately recognize as not hers. When Catherine found it, the resulting argument was recorded in painful detail by Maria's surveillance devices. "I'm done with this, Jonathan," Catherine shouted. "You can't even clean up after your lies?" Jonathan, his tone dripping with exasperation, shot back, "You're the one tearing us apart, Catherine. Do you think I have time for anyone else?" Maria leaned back in her chair, sipping tea as she listened. Their relationship, built on deceit, was unraveling thread by thread, and she was the one pulling the strings. The culmination of Maria's efforts came during a family gathering she had orchestrated under the guise of reconciliation. She invited both Jonathan and Catherine, her demeanor calm and cheerful as though she were none the wiser. As they sat awkwardly at opposite ends of the living room, Maria brought up an innocuous story from their shared childhood, one that placed Catherine in a compromising position. It was subtle, but the pointed undertone was enough to make Catherine squirm. Jonathan noticed. "Is there something I'm missing?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Catherine flushed, shaking her head. "Of course not." Maria let the silence hang in the air just long enough to make it uncomfortable before changing the subject. She watched with satisfaction as Jonathan and Catherine exchanged tense glances, their unease palpable. By the end of the evening, Maria had laid the groundwork for the next phase of her plan. Jonathan and Catherine were no longer allies, they were adversaries. The trust they had shared was a distant memory, replaced by doubt and frustration. They had no idea they were dancing to Maria's tune, and the finale was drawing near. Maria adjusted the hem of her dress, her heart beating a steady rhythm as the clock ticked toward evening. The family dinner she had carefully orchestrated was minutes away, and the tension in the air felt electric. She had invited Jonathan, Catherine, and several close relatives, under the guise of celebrating togetherness. In truth, this was another step in her calculated game, a stage set to expose the growing cracks in their web of lies. The doorbell rang and Maria opened it to find Catherine standing nervously on the porch. Her sister's once effortless composure now seemed forced, her smile faltering as Maria embraced her. "So good to see you," Maria said, her tone laced with warmth that belied her inner rage. Behind Catherine, Jonathan arrived, his expression strained. He greeted Maria with a kiss on the cheek as if nothing was amiss and stepped inside. She watched his movements carefully, the tension in his shoulders, the subtle way he avoided meeting Catherine's eyes. The rest of the family trickled in, filling the living room with chatter and laughter. Maria played the perfect hostess, offering drinks and snacks, keeping her demeanor light. Jonathan and Catherine sat on opposite sides of the room, their interactions minimal, but Maria noted every furtive glance and every averted gaze. As dinner was served, Maria subtly steered the conversation into dangerous territory. "It's been so long since we've all been together like this," she said with a smile. "I remember when we used to share everything, secrets, worries, even crushes." Catherine froze mid-sip of her wine, her eyes darting toward Jonathan. He stiffened but kept his focus on his plate. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife, but Maria pretended not to notice. "You've always been the close one in the family, Catherine," Maria continued, her voice tinged with a sweetness that felt like a blade. "Always so thoughtful, so good at keeping secrets." Jonathan cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "It's nice to see everyone together," he said, forcing a smile. "It's been too long." Maria locked eyes with him, her smile unwavering. "It really has. And it's so important to be honest with the people you love, don't you think?" Catherine shifted uncomfortably, her fork clattering against her plate. "Maria, this dinner is lovely. You've really outdone yourself." "Oh, it's nothing," Maria said breezily. "I just wanted everyone to feel connected. After all, family is everything." After dinner, Maria offered to serve dessert in the living room. As everyone settled in, she noticed Jonathan and Catherine gravitate toward opposite corners of the room. Their discomfort was palpable, their nerves fraying under the weight of her subtle provocations. Maria seized the moment. "I was going through some old photos the other day," she said, holding up a stack of prints. "I found a lot of memories I'd almost forgotten." She handed a photo to her aunt, who laughed at the image of a childhood birthday party. Maria continued passing the photos around, letting the family reminisce, before stopping in front of Catherine and Jonathan. She held up a picture of herself and Catherine as children, smiling brightly at the camera. "Do you remember this day, Catherine?" Maria asked, her tone light but her eyes sharp. Catherine hesitated, glancing at Jonathan. "Of course," she murmured. "You were always the adventurous one," Maria said, her voice dropping slightly. "Always taking risks. Always testing limits." Catherine's cheeks flushed and Jonathan's hand tightened around his glass. Maria reveled in their discomfort, letting the silence stretch before moving on. As the evening wound down, the tension was unbearable. Catherine left abruptly, mumbling something about an early morning. Jonathan followed shortly after, offering Maria a tight smile before stepping out the door. Maria closed it behind them, exhaling slowly. Her plan was working. The family had noticed the unease between Jonathan and Catherine. Whispers had already begun. Maria had planted the seeds and soon, the truth would bloom in full view. Her phone buzzed with a message from Catherine. "We need to talk." Maria smiled, her heart steady as she replied, "Soon?" The living room was unusually quiet, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Maria had called for a family meeting, carefully framing it as an opportunity to clear the air and strengthen their bonds. The truth, of course, was far from benign. Jonathan and Catherine sat on opposite ends of the room, their nervous energy palpable, while the rest of the family exchanged puzzled glances. Maria stood near the mantel, holding a slim folder in her hands. Inside were the weeks of evidence she had meticulously gathered. Photographs, recordings, and transcripts that would dismantle the facade Jonathan and Catherine had built. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind, but now that it was here, her hands trembled ever so slightly. "Thank you all for coming," Maria began, her voice steady despite the storm within her. "I've been thinking a lot about what family means, about trust, loyalty, and respect." Her eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Jonathan, whose jaw tightened, and then on Catherine, who avoided her gaze entirely. "And I've realized," Maria continued, "that sometimes the people we hold closest to us are the ones who betray us the most." A ripple of confusion passed through the room. Maria reached into the folder and pulled out the first photograph, a grainy image of Jonathan and Catherine entering a hotel together. She held it up for everyone to see. "This," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "is my husband and my sister." The room erupted into murmurs. Jonathan shot to his feet, his face pale. "Maria, what are you doing?" Maria didn't flinch. "Sit down, Jonathan. We're just getting started." She laid the photo on the coffee table, then pulled out a USB drive. Plugging it into the television, she navigated to a folder of video clips. The first recording played, Jonathan and Catherine in her living room, their voices low but unmistakable. "You can't keep lying to her," Catherine said on screen. "I'll handle it," Jonathan replied. "Just give me time." The room fell silent as the recording continued. Every whispered word, every damning admission, was like a knife slicing through the tense atmosphere. Catherine buried her face in her hands, while Jonathan sat frozen, his eyes fixed on the screen. Maria paused the video and turned to face them. "How long?" she asked, her voice trembling with controlled fury. "How long have you two been doing this behind my back?" Catherine finally looked up, her face streaked with tears. "Maria, Save it," Maria snapped, her voice rising. "You betrayed me, Catherine. You were my sister. How could you?" Catherine's sobs grew louder, but Maria didn't let her off the hook. She turned to Jonathan, her eyes blazing. "And you," she spat. "I trusted you with my life, my love, my everything. Was any of it real? Or was it all a lie?" Jonathan tried to speak, his voice shaky. "Maria, it wasn't. It's complicated." "No," Maria interrupted. "It's simple. You're a liar and a coward." The rest of the family sat in stunned silence, their shock and discomfort written across their faces. Maria turned to them, her voice softer now but no less resolute. "I'm sorry you had to see this," she said. "But I refuse to be silenced. They thought they could deceive me, but I won't let them get away with it." Jonathan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm leaving," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "You're not leaving with my dignity," Maria said, her tone icy. "You've already taken enough." Jonathan hesitated, then stormed out of the house. Catherine remained seated, her sobs quieter now, her face buried in her hands. Maria didn't look at her as she collected the evidence from the table. "This is over," Maria said, her voice firm. "For both of you." The rest of the family looked at her, a mix of admiration and pity in their eyes. Maria straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of her decision lift ever so slightly. She had spoken her truth, exposed their betrayal, and reclaimed her voice. As she walked out of the room, she felt a newfound sense of freedom. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something new. The morning after the confrontation, Maria woke to a house that felt eerily quiet. The echoes of the previous night still lingered, the memory of Jonathan's and Catherine's guilt-laden faces etched into her mind. She sat up in bed, her body heavy with the weight of what had transpired, yet her spirit felt lighter. For the first time in months, the truth was out, and she was free from the suffocating grip of their lies. Maria made herself a cup of coffee and sat by the kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. It was beautiful, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had unfolded the night before. But in that moment, Maria made a decision. She wouldn't let their betrayal define her. She had more to live for than the broken pieces they'd left behind. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Jonathan didn't return home, and Maria had no intention of contacting him. The house felt emptier without his presence, but it was a relief rather than a loss. She took the time to reclaim her space, rearranging the furniture, boxing up his belongings, and donating them to charity. With every item she removed, she felt a piece of herself returning. Her family, too, had been rocked by the revelation. Some rallied around her, offering their support and love, while others struggled to process the betrayal. Catherine had tried to reach out multiple times, her messages filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. Maria couldn't bring herself to respond, not yet. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would be on her terms. Instead, Maria focused on herself. She revisited old hobbies she had long abandoned: painting, gardening, and writing. The journal she had tucked away years ago became her confidant, each page an outlet for her pain, her anger, and her hopes for the future. One afternoon, Maria ventured into the town square, a place she hadn't visited in months. As she walked through the bustling streets, she was surprised by the warmth of the community. Neighbors stopped to greet her, their smiles genuine, their words kind. "We heard what happened," one elderly woman said, her eyes filled with compassion. "You're so strong, Maria. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Maria nodded, her throat tightening. She hadn't realized how much she had isolated herself during the months of suspicion and betrayal. Now she saw the value in connection, in leaning on others when the weight became too much to bear. It was during this outing that she stumbled upon a small art studio offering painting classes. The sign in the window caught her attention, and on impulse she stepped inside. The instructor, a kind man with a warm smile, welcomed her and encouraged her to join the class. It felt like a spark, a small but significant step toward rediscovering herself. As weeks turned into months, Maria found herself healing in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her newfound independence brought clarity and strength. She had faced the darkest betrayal and emerged stronger, more self-assured. The woman staring back at her in the mirror was no longer the same Maria who had silently endured Jonathan's lies. She was someone new, someone whole. When Catherine reached out again, this time through a handwritten letter, Maria read it with a calmer heart. Catherine's words were filled with regret, acknowledging the pain she had caused and asking for a chance to mend their fractured relationship. Maria didn't reply right away. She wasn't ready to face Catherine, but she wasn't ready to close the door completely either. For now, she would focus on herself. The wounds were still tender, and she owed it to herself to heal fully before deciding whether forgiveness was possible. One evening, as Maria sat in her garden, her hands streaked with soil from planting new flowers, she looked around and felt a sense of peace. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been a turning point. It had forced her to confront the cracks in her life and rebuild something stronger, something beautiful. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in soft twilight. Maria leaned back in her chair, a small smile tugging at her lips. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it. Maria stood at the edge of her garden, her hands resting on her hips as she admired the riot of color blooming around her. The months of tending to the flowers had been as therapeutic as they had been transformative. Each seed she planted, each petal that unfurled, mirrored her journey, a testament to growth after devastation. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her back to the present. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from Lucy, her best friend, inviting her to an upcoming community event. Maria smiled, remembering how much she had once loved such gatherings. For too long she had avoided them, retreating into herself. Now she felt ready to rejoin the world. The community center was abuzz with energy, filled with laughter and conversation. Maria stepped inside, her head held high. She was greeted with smiles and warm embraces from friends and acquaintances who had watched her transformation from a distance. "You look amazing," Lucy said, pulling Maria into a tight hug. "It's so good to see you out and about." Maria grinned. "It feels good to be here." As the evening unfolded, Maria found herself at ease, chatting with old friends and even making new connections. She felt lighter, freer, as though the weight of the past had finally lifted. Her laughter rang out, genuine and unrestrained, and she realized how long it had been since she had felt this kind of joy. Back at home, Maria reflected on the evening, her heart full. Her journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. She had learned to trust herself again, to find strength in her independence. Jonathan and Catherine were no longer the central figures in her story. They were footnotes in a narrative that now belonged solely to her. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from an art studio. The instructor she had met weeks ago had encouraged her to submit one of her paintings to a local exhibit. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the notification. Then, with a deep breath, she clicked submit. It was a small act, but to Maria, it felt monumental. It was her way of stepping into the light, of sharing the person she had become with the world. The day of the art exhibit arrived, and Maria stood in the gallery, surrounded by strangers admiring her work. The painting she had submitted, a vibrant depiction of a tree regrowing its branches after a storm, felt like a piece of her soul laid bare. A woman approached her, her eyes warm. "Your painting is beautiful," she said. "It feels so hopeful." Maria smiled. Thank you. That's exactly what it's meant to be. As she left the gallery that evening, Maria felt a surge of pride and gratitude. She had turned her pain into something beautiful, something that could inspire others. Later that night, Maria sat on her porch, a glass of wine in hand as she looked up at the stars. The darkness no longer felt suffocating. It felt expansive, filled with possibilities. She thought of Catherine's letter, still tucked away in her drawer, and felt a pang of sadness. Perhaps one day she would find it in her heart to forgive. But forgiveness, she had learned, was not something to rush. It was a gift she could offer only when she was truly ready. For now, she would focus on the life she was building, one filled with purpose, love, and strength. The betrayal that had once shattered her had become the catalyst for her rebirth, and she was determined to make the most of her second chance. Maria took a deep breath, her lips curving into a smile. The future was hers, and she was ready to embrace it. What do you think about Maria's journey? Do you believe she should forgive Catherine and Jonathan eventually, or is her decision to focus on herself the best path forward? If Maria's story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more inspiring narratives. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on her journey.